University of Edinburgh, and he will talk about search in supply chain. So, Lauri, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to Teams be here online and present this to you all. And all right, so the talk is titled Search in Supply Chains, which is, I believe, like the minimal description of the paper that you can more or less give. But the motivation of the project is the observation that, of course, in modern economies, production depends increasingly on highly specialized, sophisticated, and potentially fragile supply chains. And by now we have many examples. Latest here in Barcelona, the countrywide blackout, whose economic effects we don't even know yet. We have plenty of examples that disturbances in these supply chains can have large aggregate effects. So, for example, the pandemic, the 2011 Japanese earthquake that has been very well studied in the literature, and ongoing trade wars, which also get more and more interesting by the month almost. Right. And when we look at sort of these production networks, or we can think of supply chains as just being collections of linkages between buyers and suppliers. And when we look at the set of these linkages, the economy's production network, we usually see across different countries certain regularities. I would like to focus your attention on two of these. So first of all, these firm-to-firm links tend to be highly sparse. So most firms have a limited number of buyers and suppliers with whom they trade. And they may source on the sort of product level, they may source critical inputs from just one or a couple of suppliers. So this suggests that maybe forming trade relationships between firms is costly for various reasons, such as finding suitable inputs, especially for your production process, or customizing these inputs so that they fit into the car you are making, for example, or contractual frictions. And the second fact I would like to sort of motivate my talk with is that these linkages seem to be highly persistent and time-consuming to form. And as a result, replacing lost buyers and suppliers is a highly time-consuming process. So regarding the first part of the sentence, actually Federico Neus, who is probably well known to most of you, finds in his job market paper that the median firm in Chile retains more than 50% of trade partners each year, while Eugenia Ucci, who's also actually worked with Fede on another project using Chilean data, finds in his job market paper that if a firm loses a supplier in an unanticipated manner, it can take up to several years to find a replacement, and sales can decline significantly. For example, up to a fifth. So losing key buyers and suppliers is highly important for firm dynamics. So the natural question is, if firms are sometimes very reliant on key buyers and suppliers, and creating and replacing these links is slow, then what is the effect of these facts on propagation of shocks in supply chains? And what I do in this paper, this is mostly going to be a theoretical talk. So in this paper, I developed a dynamic theory of endogenous supply chain formation with two sort of distinguishing features. One is that there are explicit firm-to-firm links. So firms are linked to a limited number of other firms. And adjusting these links is slow, which is modeled through search frictions. Right. So,
yeah,
of course,
before we move, Lauri, we have a question.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Luciano, please go ahead.
Hi, Lauri, thank you. Just a clarification question. I remember that there are some new papers with endogenous networks. I remember it was one by Acemoglu, but if I recall correctly, the network can also change with the size of a shock. Of course, when there are some, so the network could move. The network could actually move or have some dynamics with the business cycle, no? And could be the case that there are shocks that actually change the structure of the network. And I remember some data that when you see the input-output table 20 years ago is much sparse or less dense than what we see now. No, I don't know if it's related to your research or.
Yes, so this is specifically sort of the agenda that I'm pursuing. And I'm actually going to consider aggregate shocks. So give me the usual 2 slides, and I will hopefully be able to tell you what I can say on this topic today. And yeah, the input-output table is indeed evolving, both sort of because the economy is becoming more complex. So every sector is linked to a larger number of sectors over time. But there's also, I'm not sure if people have actually managed to see sort of business cycle variation in the input-output table. So usually that would require sort of firm-to-firm data to see. I think Mathieu Taschereau-Dumichel has something on the evolution of the sort of firm's distribution of number of suppliers across the business cycle. But right. So there's a growing literature on how production networks propagate shocks. There's new papers popping up, a couple of important ones every quarter at this point. But in terms of the theoretical frameworks, they still tend to mainly fall into a limited number of categories, which don't necessarily cover all the bases of interesting questions that are out there. So there are lots of static frameworks that can feature risky supply chains or fragile supply chains, such as this paper by Elliott, Golub, and Leduc in the AER, this newer one by Kopitov, Taschereau-Dumichel, and Niemark, and others. And then there's a number of dynamic production network models, but they often simplify the problem in a number of ways. So for example, they don't have forward-looking firms that could react to shocks in advance and create networks that are more safe. Or they don't feature any frictions in the adjustment of the network. Or they make a number of assumptions such that these linkages are actually not risky. So for example, if you assume that you're connected to a continuum of firms, a sort of law of large numbers applies, and you don't necessarily get any riskiness from the network itself. So what's sort of missing in the theoretical literature is models where there could be large effects from shocks to key buyers and suppliers, which are hard to replace over time. Right. The issue, of course, is if you write down the basic production network formation model and make it dynamic with adjustment frictions and so on, the firm would usually have to keep track of the entire network. So every firm's state space would be the entire production network of the economy, and that is just impossible of a model to solve. So what I do here is I propose a sort of tractable model, making a number of simplifications, and a novel solution method, which I won't go that much into detail, but Miguel, there's a question.
Lauri, thank you. So I was wondering if you consider like any benefits of having a sparse network, like, okay, you have a few suppliers, it's that poses the risks that you just mentioned, but at the same time, you build relationships with the suppliers, which should end up, easing any information constraints and giving you better terms of contracts with the supplier, cheaper trade credit, stuff like that, right? So is there any like trade-off for the firm to think about, okay, maybe I don't need as many suppliers because I focus on a few that give me some benefits with deeper relationships. It is worth it for me to have fewer relationships.
So I don't explicitly model these kinds of costs, but I sort of assume that these relationships will be highly sparse from the get-go. So there could be reasons like this. It's just hard to have, or very costly to have, several customized suppliers for each input that you're using. So, but that is, I think it's a great point. Okay, so very briefly, what I do in the paper is I propose a dynamic model of risky supply chains, where the time cost of forming links is captured by random search for buyers and suppliers. Second, the sort of first set of results concerns the trade-offs in firms' supply chain formation. So firms will not necessarily always form the most profitable matches in terms of static profit. Instead, they have a concern for the future continuation value. So they might avoid fragile chains that are likely to dissolve, even if they're currently very profitable. And sometimes they might join low profit supply chains if sort of as a unit, the supply chain has a better chances of attracting high profit trade partners. Might also do a brief discussion of some early results on welfare and inefficiencies in the model, but let's see when we get there. And solve sort of larger versions of the model, I also make a methodological contribution. So I propose a tractable solution method for dynamic supply chain models, which is sort of has a flavor, similar flavor as the Krusell-Smith model. So we first reduce the state space. Instead of tracking the entire supply chain, we replace this with a number of summary statistics, and then sort of solve the model using Monte Carlo simulation. The second set of results that I'm going to show you using this method is a sort of aggregate supply chain disturbance, where I quantify the recovery of the economy and the supply chains of the economy after there's a shock that severs a large fraction of links. So I'm sort of going to base this on the example of the Great Japanese Earthquake of 2011, which has been very well studied in the literature, like this famous paper of Carvalho, Tabassalehi, and others. And sort of to preview the results there, in fact, firms' endogenous matching behavior sort of makes the recovery faster than if linkages recover we sort of directly, slowly return to the optimal steady state matches. Okay, so literature, I mostly contribute to dynamic...
May I interrupt you?
Yeah, of course.
Can you go back,
Thank
please?
you, Ernesto. Yes.
So a couple of points that it's just clarification. So
Yes.
you started from the premise that the input-output linkages are the input-output structure of the economy is sparse. But point two seems to you are saying that due to uncertainty is less sparse than if there is less uncertainty. If you if there is more diversification of the of input-output relationships, it means that it's less sparsity. Is that right?
So I'm not going to actually sort of discuss diversification here. I'm going to assume that firms will be choosing a key buyer and a key supplier, and they need to make a sort of good choice for these. So they want to source from a very limited number of suppliers, in this case only one, but they want to choose this network so that it is has
so
optimal...
point two is pro-sparsity. It's a way to explain sparsity.
So I would say that in a more general framework, it can go into different directions. So uncertainty does mean that you would like to multi-source or build inventories or sort of build in a way, invest into the relationship in a way such that it doesn't, it's more stable. But this is something that I will not be considering in the model today, but this is sort of a part of future work that I am considering taking the model to that direction once the solution method and everything is there. So we will see, hopefully.
Okay. And given this conversation, this is my second point, is if the point of the paper is about the optimality or specificity of input-output relationships, why an aggregate shock like an earthquake is a good example. It's a good laboratory to think about that specificity. I would be more expecting to see, semiconductors cannot get into a country. How that's going to screw the production chain or something, because it's basically a call of very important firms or nodes. And when that node get broken, then it's going to be a disproportionate effect on the aggregate. It's not about wiping out, let's say, a third of the links or half of the links and see what happens.
Yeah, I see. I think that's a great point, and I think I could basically actually cast the exercise in these terms as well. So there will be a shock to a particular stage of the production chains, which makes them harder to access or breaks the existing linkages, and they have to be rebuilt. So it could be, yeah. I think it's a fair point, and I think that's a good
Now,
thing to
just to
consider for the
finish,
narrative.
just to be fair, it's an interesting result that the one that you have in 4. So I can imagine that a result of the paper is that if there is a particular node that is very important and that node get destroyed, it's going to have a very large effect in the aggregate. But if you destroy some other node, some other nodes, not much is going to happen, and actually you can have a quick recovery. So
Yeah, exactly.
so it's sort of no linearity, depends on where you are impacted, that can give you richness in the predictions of the model.
Yeah, exactly. I think I fully agree. Let's see sort of how close we get to that in the actual exercise. And maybe there's actually ways to do the exercise better to take this point into account. Right. So let me just skip the literature. Of course, we're working with dynamic production networks, but mostly bringing in two things that I think are key to my framework, which is this risky firm-to-firm links and the fact that creating them takes time. Otherwise, yeah. Let's just, if there's no further questions, let me just jump into the model and start explaining how the framework works. Okay, so I want to give you just sort of graphically a brief overview of the main features of the model in one diagram. So this is an economy where I work in continuous time and so far in steady state. So there's no aggregate uncertainty that the firms take into account. And the economy is going to produce a number of differentiated final goods using multiple stages of production. So there's a finite number of intermediate stages that are going to be used in this process. And each one of these lines over here represents the fact that there's a continuum of firms in each one of these production stages. Each firm in each stage is going to combine labor and inputs to make their output. And if they don't have a supplier for inputs, they can make, I assume that they can make them in-house. So for example, let's take a simple example. We are making pasta over here in stage 0 using flour sourced from stage 1, which is then requires wheat that is as farmed by farmers here in stage 2. And here's an example of a Financial Times article during the pandemic, which was asking how is the coronavirus affecting pasta's complex supply chain. So very, very real world relevant example. Anyway, I'm sorry to all Italians in the room if this simplifies the process too much. So how are firms going to be forming their supply chains? There's going to be random search for both buyers and suppliers at a rate lambda. And a key feature of the model is that while firms are matched with their buyers and suppliers, they're still going to be searching for better matches. And here I assume this search also happens at a rate lambda, because this is sort of not the same as necessarily unemployment, where we could consider on-the-job search that is less efficient because you actually have to work. So here, let's just make a simplifying assumption. And related to discussion with Ernesto earlier, I'm going to be considering I'm going to make a strong assumption and consider sort of snake-like supply chains, as in, for example, Antras and the Gortari in the trade literature. So each firm is going to have a maximum of one buyer and one seller. So the idea is sort of forming an optimal long-term match with your main buyer and your main supplier. There's some supporting, of course, this is not the most realistic assumption we could make. It's highly tractable, but there's some evidence from Belgium that firms do a significant fraction of their trade with their main buyer and their main supplier. Over 50% of expenditures and purchases is spent on the sort of main relationships. But it would not be too difficult to actually add, for example, multiple buyers to the model or multiple different types of inputs. Right. Okay, so we have, I think, everything here we discussed. We have a continuum of firms per stage. They have technology. There's also households in the model which just work and earn able labor income and own the firms, and they consume pasta on the final stage. Okay, so what do supply chains in this economy look like? So here in blue, we have an example of a fully diversified supply chain where every stage of the production process of pasta is taken by a different firm. And I assume in this model that this leads to sort of a gain from specialization. So you will always sort of, in a static sense, you would always prefer to have outsourcing different parts of the production process. It's also possible for firms to be sort of partially connected. So over here, this firm would be both farming wheat and then milling it into flour and then selling it to the pasta firm over here. Firms that do not have access to the final buyer market, I assume that they still sort of remain dormant and inactive in the sense that they do not produce, they do not use any labor or inputs. But the idea is that this flour mill over here in stage one, this green one, sort of if they've been serving some excellent pasta producer in the past, which for example has gone bankrupt. But if they started to produce again, if they got a deal from a pasta company, they would know which flour producer to call. Sorry, which wheat producer to call. So these relationships stay dormant. And yeah, it's also possible for firms to produce like fully in-house. Okay, so I think we've discussed most of what we have here. The idea sort of in the background is that if you don't have these customized long-term relationships, you could still access inputs and sell your inputs to a generic market at a lower profit, or purchase a generic input at a higher cost. So this is the sort of fundamental idea. Okay, there's no question on that. Let me go into detail on the...
Sorry,
yes.
Lauri. So the non-profit is kind of a normalization type of thing. So, or
yeah, kind of.
it's like the unit price. Okay.
It's sort of assuming that there's you could assume that there's sort of they're selling to a fully competitive market. This would make the model slightly different, but not very much.
I mean, then you have it's kind of a normalization in terms that the profits that you would observe in the other markets are just in relative terms to okay.
Yes, that's right. All right, so let's go forward. So the technology that every firm in each stage is endowed with is, if they have a supplier, they produce using labor and inputs from the upstream stage with a Cobb-Douglas production function, which after normalization implies a unit cost, which depends on their idiosyncratic productivity, which is going to, it's heterogeneous, depends on the wage, which I for now assume is the same across different types of labor and different sectors. And crucially, on the cost of their inputs. So over here, this is the price of the input, and this is a kind of, this Q over here is a kind of productivity gain from specialization, from committing into a long-term relationship. You can get a customized input, which increases your productivity. So there's recent evidence, for example, from David Baguet and others, that adding suppliers actually reduces your marginal cost. If you don't have a supplier, you can still produce, but using only labor, so you have this standard type of unit cost. And productivity is heterogeneous, follows a Markov chain on a finite set. And for now, I assume that prices are made as an exogenous markup over the cost, like a lot of papers in the literature, Acemoglu and Azar, for example. But obviously, this would be very interesting to sort of see what is in fact the optimal pricing scheme in this economy. But for example, Nash bargaining, which usually works nicely in search models, becomes intractable in this framework. All right. So firms have cost-douglas technologies. They face a CS final demand for pasta and exogenous markups. So what they do is they try to minimize their unit cost. And the flow profit that each firm receives is going to be determined by the entire chain's unit cost. And and their state variable is going to be the vector of productivities in the entire chain. So this is the object that each firm will have to track as their state variable. So this can be, but then depending on age, this can be a very large state variable. Their main decision after unit cost minimization is if they meet they draw a new buyer or a new supplier, will they match or will they not? And this is summarized by an acceptance policy. So here's some further detail on how their profits are determined. It mostly depends on the fact that each firm sort of receives from their buyer a fraction of the revenue of the buyer, which then a fraction of that is passed on to the supplier, and a fraction of that is passed on to the next supplier, and so on. So it depends on your position in the chain, your relative cost of your entire chain. So how cheaply can your chain make pasta? This determines how much demand you're going to get, and a result, your profit. And then, yes, the unit cost of the chain is going to depend on the average productivity of the entire chain, and some other terms that depend on the quality and the markup and on the wage. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So there, just a quick question. So if I understand, if you make a match with a supplier, the efficiency of the match, it's always the same for that pair. Firm supplier. I mean, it doesn't decrease over time if you keep the same supplier, or does it?
It can, because there are idiosyncratic productivity shocks. So if a match was good today and a shock happens or something happens in the rest of the chain somewhere, this means that your assessment of your current chain can change dramatically.
Right, but that happens across all of your suppliers. Right, you have productivity shock that changes the efficiency of the match with all of the suppliers given that. But my point is there any benefit in keeping a supplier even if productivity doesn't change through time?
So basically, if I understand correctly, this would be this sort of term over here that means that you do get some benefit from outsourcing tasks by default. And on top of that, you sort of get the productivity of your supplier. If it's high, that can also lower your marginal cost and increase your demand. So, but I'm not sure if that answers your question completely.
Thanks. Now let's go ahead and we can circle back to that later. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, one question. Just really, I don't know if it's related, but if I just want to see if I get it correctly. So the persistence in the connections will be driven by the persistence in productivity shocks.
So it's going to be driven by two things: the persistence in productivity shocks, and then the sort of matching frictions. So if there's heavy matching frictions, even if you're trapped in a bad match or you don't have a match at all, it's going to be difficult for you to replace this.
Okay, so you're going to still have persistence in the connections, even in the case productivity is IID, because of the
yes. So if I had IID productivity from one period to the next, let's say, despite continuous time that we make it somehow, yes, there would. Okay. So search, we already discussed. There's random search for both buyers and suppliers. Matched firms can still search in the match, so kind of on the job, but here in supply chain context. This means that your buyer or supplier may get poached by other firms, but also your buyer or supplier may sort of do you a favor and upgrade your profit by upgrading their own buyers and suppliers, and so on. I believe the rest of this we have discussed, except the fact that there's also exogenous link destruction with a rate delta as usual. Right. So I think the rest of this I would just like to tell you that the thing that firms really decide is if they can find a match that lets them move from a chain, a vector of productivity is X to another vector X prime, will they accept this match or not? And then we just, solve a typical dynamic programming problem given this very complicated transition matrix that these decisions and the evolution of productivity shocks and the evolution of exogenous separations implies. So I think I want to just show you, I just want to show you graphically sort of what types of events can we have in these supply chains. So that I think this is the clearest way to understand the model. So why is this tractable, first of all? Because we work in continuous time and where we work with Poisson events, which means that there's only a maximum of one event that can happen in each supply chain per period. So, for example, it's not possible that both me and my supplier meet someone new, and then we start to trade, we start to haggle on the surplus and discuss, will we keep the match or not? This sort of makes solving the model much more simple. So it's not possible that, for example, two meetings happen at the same instant. So what can happen in the chain is there can be a productivity shock in one stage at a time, sorry. So for example, here, the productivity of this firm number 3, I don't know if you can see the box that I've drawn, but it goes up. You yourself, if you're this firm over here, you can meet an alternative supplier or an alternative buyer. There can be someone else in your chain that matches with a new buyer or supplier, or there can be link destruction. And link destruction can happen for two reasons: exogenously at the rate delta, or endogenously if a firm just decides to leave your chain for a better one. Right. So this concludes the exposition of the model. If there's any other questions at this point, I'm happy to take them, but otherwise I would move on to the first set of sort of results. And right. And sorry, I think I might sometimes have missed if there was a hand being raised because I need to resize the window. Okay, good. Right, okay, so let's look at the sort of first set of results. So let's look at the sort of implications of this model for matching behavior in steady state, so without aggregate shocks. So these firms are making forward-looking matching decisions faced with adjustment frictions in and firm-to-firm links. So what they care about is obviously the flow profit that they're getting each period, but also the continuation value in a certain chain tomorrow. So I'm going to show you with two examples that firms might not always match with the highest profit chain, if it's sometimes likely, it's more likely to dissolve. But on the other hand, they might sometimes go for a very low profit or even zero profit chain if they see it as sort of having high growth potential. Right. So here's an example of the chain stability effect. So there's a lot going on in this figure. So let me walk you through it slowly. So over here on the left, we have graphical examples of two different types of supply chains, chain A and chain B. And here on the left, we have a value function of the firm that's making the decision between chain A and chain B. So this firm is over here in stage 2. It has medium productivity 2. So productivity goes, in this example, can be 1, 2, or 3. So we have this firm over here that's making a decision between this chain A or this chain B. And here's the value function in this sort of small world of a firm that is in stage 2 and has productivity level 2. And you see that this chain A has a higher value, despite, I hope you can see this, but despite having a lower flow profit. And why is this? Let's analyze these chains A and B. So in chain A, all the firms are sort of medium productivity, which means, you know, decent but lower profits. While in this alternative chain, the pasta maker is highly productive, which means that there's high demand and hence higher profit in this type of supply chain. However, the firm will still choose this chain A just because it is less fragile. Because what can happen here is that another firm, another supply chain can come and poach this highly profitable pasta maker, which means that this chain B over here is highly fragile. Okay, so and I've plotted here the dissolution probabilities of all these different chains, and you can see that the dissolution probability of chain B is very high compared to chain A. Okay, but there's another. This can go both ways. It's also possible that sometimes firms choose to go for a very low profit chain structure today because they see this as a potential sort of gazelle firm, the potential gazelle chain that can grow a lot in the future. So again, we have the same firm in stage 2 making a choice between chains A and B. And here are the value functions. You again see that chain A has a higher value, despite making 0 profit today, because there is no final buyer. This chain is completely inactive at the moment, or making 0 profit. And the reason is that because the rest of the chain is so productive, they're actually able to attract, very likely to attract a very high profit pasta maker. If you compare to the previous example, it is in fact this poaching event that happens over here as well. This is exactly the same chain. So, right. So this is kind of the sort of trade-offs that firms face when forming their supply chains in an environment like this. Now, you might ask, are there inefficiencies in the model? So is there anything a social planner would like to do? And first of all, there's an obvious source of inefficiencies, which is the markup. But on top of that, there's also a possibility of inefficient turnover, because it may be bilaterally optimal for 2 firms to match, because they get a bilateral welfare gain from this, or profit gain. But the loss of other firms who sort of have to search again and match again can be so much worse that this match actually lowers social welfare in the aggregate. I will spare you the details of the social planner problem and the computational difficulties. The sort of early numerical results I have are that the markups don't distort decisions very much. They distort matching decisions very much. They only lower labor demand. But eliminating this sort of inefficient turnover, so not allowing firms to make bilaterally optimal matches, could actually improve welfare by a lot. Okay, how much time do we have? I think the clock started around 5 minutes or
Yeah,
so.
You have until your 10 p.m. Yeah.
10 p.m. Okay, so we
Yeah,
are
it was-
going relatively quickly. Okay, so let me briefly introduce you to the numerical method that we're working with here. So next step is the sort of aggregate supply chain disturbances, and I hope I would like to hear Ernesto's opinion on whether that's or just what you think about it. But let me just first introduce you the numerical method that I use to solve the larger versions of the model. So as already hinted at in the introduction, it's going to be sort of inspired by the Krusell-Smith algorithm for heterogeneous agent models with a distribution of assets, which then affects prices that agents face and hence the general equilibrium. But What I do here is two similar steps, but the problem is in some ways very different. So what I do is, first, I reduce the state space to a set of key summary statistics. So I assume that firms don't track all the productivities of all the firms in the entire chain. So they don't use all possible information when forecasting. They instead just use a limited number of summary statistics. So in particular, the unit cost of the chain is a key summary statistic. The chain length up and down is one that captures sort of the possibility of adding or removing buyers and suppliers. And then after I reduce the state space to only these combinations of summary statistics, I solve the model iteratively using Monte Carlo simulation. So you get some policies, you simulate the model, you update firms' forecasts and policies, and loop this until conclusion. But sort of, we're actually not solving the sort of economy in response to aggregate shocks here. Firms are here tracking their own supply chains. So we're sort of applying it to the quasi aggregate problem of the firms. Okay, and the summary statistics that I actually use here are the unit cost of the chain and the downstream and upstream chain lengths. And with just these statistics, I get sort of excellent accuracy, but you could always add further moments, sort of as inspired by the Crusell-Smith algorithm. You could consider something that talks about the variability in the productivities in the supply chain. So here's just sort of graphical illustration of the accuracy of the method in a model that can be solved both analytically and using this method. So these are the value functions computed using the two methods, and you see that they don't always perfectly overlap, but it seems decent. Okay, so to go forward to the second set of results. So
Lauri?
Yes.
Lauri, I have a question about the method.
Yes.
So you're using this to summarize the aggregate information that the firm takes into account, like in Crusell-Smith, but without aggregate shocks. That's the part you do here, no?
Right. So what they're summarizing is basically, well, let's go here, for example. They're summarizing this. So I am a firm that's over here, and I summarize the rest of my chain using these moments. And as I decide which chains I would like to match with or not, I also use this limited set of information in making these types of decisions. So yeah, I'm not actually tracking the full distribution of chains. So you could do sort of Crusell-Smith on top of Crusell-Smith in a way to do these kinds of things. Or more likely, yeah, go ahead.
So you're like, to make the parallel with Crusell-Smith, Crusell-Smith says something like you only have to track the average capital to forecast the interest rate, and you're done. No, you're doing something like that with the possibilities of the different networks that every firm can have, because that's an infinite dimensional object, no?
Well,
so you say,
it's a high dimensional object. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So precisely, that's right. And but it's slightly different.
You're not dealing with aggregate shocks here, still.
No, not in this explicit way. And there's actually there's a sort of interesting. Well, you are dealing with the fact that firms also have to track the probabilities of finding different matches. So in that sense, they do track those things as well. So each firm is computing their transition matrix from each chain to each other chain throughout the simulation. And so in a way, this is a little bit more complicated than Crusoe-Smith, because as you mentioned in Crusoe-Smith, firms only want to know one thing. They want to know the price of capital and the wage in some versions. And they only need one moment to keep track of that. Here, firms need to know the possibilities of all the possible matches that they can make in this economy. So this is like it's very hard. It's a very hard object to keep track of, even using the Crusoe-Smith method. So actually, like in ongoing work, I'm exploring using deep learning to summarize this. So I have some colleagues at Edinburgh that are working on labor market models that actually end up having very similar structure computationally. So this just yeah, side note, but thank you. Okay, so okay, so let me move to the second and last set of results. So analyzing a sort of aggregate supply chain disturbance and the effect of firms' matching behavior on the recovery. So we know that sort of breakup or disruption of supply chain links is a key feature of many present, past, and future feared supply chain disruptions. So the pandemic, trade wars, the Japanese earthquake, the Ukraine war, and as Ernesto mentioned, like, for example, there are these geopolitical tensions in certain parts of the world that are threatening our supply of semiconductors, which is like also one I actually, in fact, used to have it as a bullet point on this list as well. So the question is, how does this costly, time-consuming link formation affect the recovery after a disturbance like this?
Do you have data for Germany access to Russian gas?
So I know that there has been the sort of great German gas debate between Ben Moll and his team, and then the well, basically the German Business Confederation and other economists. But I haven't actually looked into whether the data they use is available. So let me make a note of that.
Recovery there seems to be. I mean, we don't know the counterfactual, but factually, we saw no recession in Germany. So it's suggestive that the network adapted quite quickly, which could go in your favor, I think.
Yeah. So it's to a large degree a question of sort of the availability of alternative suppliers. So right. Yeah, I will get to that hopefully also in a second. So the shock that I simulate here is I choose 5% of firms in the last stage 3, and I break all their links with stage 2. And this is sort of based on a little bit what happened according to this paper during the Japanese earthquake. And I compare the full endogenous model with search to a benchmark to sort of understand the importance of matching behavior. In this benchmark, firms are going to return to their steady state match at a constant rate. So this could be understood as an approximation to a model where there are no productivity shocks, but each firm has a sort of optimal supplier that they want to match back to, and you can rematch with a certain probability with a similar firm. And I calibrate the two scenarios, the endogenous and exogenous scenario, in a way such that the total number of links in the economy recovers on the same rate on average. Right. So for calibration, I just use 4 stages in the economy, because in Belgian data, Dean and Dupré have actually sort of looked at the length of supply chains in Belgium and said that 95% of them tend to have less than 4 or 5 stages, more or less. Choose 5 productivity states. I think the other parameters like discount rates, demand elasticities, and so on are fairly standard. But let's focus on the targeted parameters, so the key moments of the model. So the most important one is the match arrival rate. So how quickly are firms able to find alternative matches if they lose one? And for this, my target moment comes from Miauchi's paper. Actually, it has now been published in Econometrica as of this year, so I should correct this. But he finds that in the data, only around 25% of firms are able to find an alternative match after 3 years. So then I have to calibrate the productivity process, and I choose this relationship quality parameter to match average chain length. So again, using the Belgian data for that. Okay, so let's look at the results. So on impact, breaking 5% of the links takes about 1.25% off of GDP. And the recovery is very, very slow given the calibration. I want to say here that I am not necessarily wedded to this value of the match arrival rate. And one thing that we're sort of missing, I feel, in the literature is actually good estimates of these types of moments and parameters. Right. So we have a recession on impact. So output goes down both in the endogenous and exogenous setup by the same amount. So does labor productivity, and prices shoot up because this is essentially we've restricted access to an input that was making supply chains more productive. So we have an increase in marginal costs and in prices. So what we see here, though, is that in the endogenous model, with the full search and matching model, we have a much faster recovery than in the exogenous benchmark, where, as a reminder, we allow firms to return to their steady state match at a constant exogenous rate. So it's kind of like we could say it's sort of like Calvo adjustment. So the Calvo shock comes, and you're allowed to match again with your previous partner. So what's going on behind this result is, though the mass of links recovers in the economy at the same rate, as we can see here on the left panel, in the full model, there's an increase in both the creation of links and the destruction or poaching of links. So this means that there are, in fact, in the full model, the best matches get created first. So the highest productivity firms are able to find buyers and suppliers faster than the rest of the firms. But this comes sometimes at the expense of lower productivity firms. So the best firms are able to actually take matches from the rest of the economy during the recovery. So there's a little bit of a cannibalization between the affected part of the economy and the unaffected part. And we can also see this in the covariance of buyer and supplier productivities. In the full search model, it recovers much faster, meaning that these better matches get created first. And in the steady state, we end up, essentially at the same point. Right.
Sorry, what is in the x-axis?
So this is in fact years. So this is a this is a calibration with a very, very slow matching. But if I increase the match arrival rate, I basically set I get the same graphs, but with, shrinked. So I think
But the difference between the exogenous and the endogenous is going to be about the same?
So yeah, exactly. So it's about, in terms of fractions, we could say that in the exogenous model, it takes about almost twice as long. The half-life of the shock is almost twice as long, as we can see.
Regardless
here.
of lambda.
Yes. So it scales, yes, more or less.
Okay.
It pretty much scales. It scales like that. Okay. So to recap some of the lessons from this very, very rather qualitative exercise. The half-life of the shock is 2.5 years in the full model, 4.6 in the exogenous benchmark. And both link destruction and creation increase in the model with full search and matching going on. So the highest productivity buyers and suppliers are sort of able to climb the productivity ladder faster than the rest. And this is actually something that Kawakubo and Suzuki observe after the Japanese earthquake as well. So the highest productivity firms were able to match the fastest. And here they actually poach matches from unaffected firms. So there's propagation of the shock to unaffected firms through the set of their matching opportunities. So optimal behavior by firms may make supply chain disturbances more short-lived in this benchmark model. But this is true if search frictions don't interact with aggregate conditions. So for example, if we assumed some kind of cost of searching or cost of managing links or cost of adjusting links, we could also get results where things go differently. For example, it would be possible to see a scenario where the initial shock breaks some of the links, but this makes other links unprofitable as well, which endogenously leads to like a cascade of broken links. And then firms possibly becoming on the aggregate poorer and not being able to form as many links during their recovery. And this could make the recovery much slower than in the other type of scenario. So, okay, I am in my conclusion slide. Thank you so much for your attention. So I hope I've convinced you today that this sort of firm's reliance on key buyers and suppliers potentially matters a lot for adjustment dynamics if we take into account, or business cycle dynamics if we take slow adjustment into account. And this depends on the fact that, yes, firms depend on their individual buyers and suppliers, and it can be time consuming to find or replace them. And search frictions are a remarkably tractable way of modeling these search costs of the dynamic dimension of search costs when forming links. So I've shown you some new trade-offs. So the fact that there's slow link creation and this sort of on-the-job or in-the-match search means that firms engage in forward-looking behavior. So they avoid more fragile supply chains. This sort of effect you would also get if you assumed, for example, that longer chains or more complex chains are more prone to disruptions. So this kind of effects, you could bring lots of things into this baseline framework through the same technologies. But yeah, you also see that sometimes firms seek sort of high potential matches that are not currently as good, because that can help them attract better matches in the future. And yeah, for supply chain disturbances, forward-looking behavior by firms may actually accelerate recoveries, even though the supply chains are sort of growing back at the same rate if we measure it by the number of connections between different firms. So yeah, obviously this model is still highly simplified. So I think there's room for things like multiple matches, multiple buyers, this generic inputs I mentioned at some point, relationship or search costs, and also like full-on aggregate shocks and firms being able to prepare for aggregate shocks in advance. So thank you. I think this is it. I have a slide on open questions in the data for this sort of literature and this sort of frameworks. But yeah, thank you very much. Mario.
I have a small question about the. Oh, thank you very much for the presentation, by the way. But I have a question about the. I guess the main point of this literature is that the links are like that takes time and it's costly to get new links. So there's a slow adjustment in the network. So, for example, in with respect to a Leontief matrix, that everything happens at the same time. If I'm correct. So you're saying that you generate more persistence in the effects, like maybe hump shape behavior of some things and things like that. Can you get some of these things that we get in the data with these mechanisms? Like hump shape behavior of consumption, hump shape behavior of investment, things like that.
So yeah, I believe these kinds of things could come through assuming that there's sort of so one very interesting avenue is looking at the way that firms kind of invest into relationships with each other. So they sort of customize their goods, or they form logistical transportation supply chains and so on that are very much like firm pair specific. And we could see in recessions and so on that there's an initial shock that destroys some links or makes some links unproductive, but then the loss of these links affects other firms in the chain, which then makes the hump part happen. So I think this is definitely something that the framework would be able to accommodate. This would also come, as I mentioned, from link management cost or link maintenance cost. So some links become unproductive. This means that other links become unproductive as well. And there's a sort of, slow moving cascade.
And you're not going to generate that with a Leontief matrix. That's a factor.
So the basic Leontief matrix is kind of thinking of connections as happening. I think it's useful for comparing steady states. So the Leontief matrix sort of assumes that all of these rounds of propagation happen in a way instantaneously. So it's best for comparing the starting point and then the end point after all these rounds of propagation have happened. So, but if these take time, then there's then it's not as useful.
And I have another question about the method. The method, for example, if you go to Crusell-Smith, what Crusell-Smith does is like in some way linearize the problem with respect to the aggregate shock. You have something similar here in which you have some rule that is going to be linear, or it's going to have some a specific relationship, like nonlinear, I don't know, quadratic or whatever, with in your policy functions. So you're restricting your result to have a functional form there, like linear, quadratic, or whatever.
In fact, for forecasting this unit cost, I was at some point exploring, assuming that firms assume that it is a linear function of past unit costs. Now, however, the direction I've taken since then, that was working okay, but it's actually like computationally in the end easier to go more towards reinforcement learning, actually. So this is where firms sort of, they don't know their transition matrices, and they try to sort of sample the problem one time after the another, record the value that they get from each action that they took, and in this way sort of slowly build up their value function. So what's sort of happening here is a little bit like reinforcement learning with multiple players. And that's like it has different computational cost trade-offs. You have to do lots of simulation, but in a way you sort of more guaranteed
but your result
solution.
Assumes but that's not what you do here, no?
It's sort of the firms estimate their transition matrices between different states. And this changes as the equilibrium of the economy changes. So.
Okay. Thanks, Lauri.
Thanks, Mario. Great questions.
I have another question, Lauri.
Yeah.
So about the fact that one of the suppliers or the supplier that is big or small, does it? I know that that would add another dimension to the model that would make, but there's another source of literature talking about the negative or positive assortative matching. So are small firms sourcing from few but large suppliers, or are they also matching with small suppliers like their size, or would that change the fragility? Would it be more fragile for a small firm to only have one big supplier, or to have only one or two small suppliers, or?
Yeah, so this is sort of where I think these sort of results are a little bit going towards that in steady state, firms sort of try to avoid being a part of supply chains where there's a large firm that's matched to a very small supplier, and potentially you could also assume that this is a more fragile supplier that's less able to take on shocks. So there is, in a way, like all the firms here populate a continuum. So there are no sort of really large firms and small firms, but then there are more productive firms and less productive firms, and they do have higher sales, higher revenue, higher employment, and so on than other firms. So yeah, I think
Right.
you can study assortative matching here as well.
Okay. Because I guess it would also change the search time. So I guess it's more difficult to find another Amazon than to find another, I don't know, company that it's pretty small or pretty substitutable or.
Yeah, it depends sort of like, if your production technology is such that you can buy all the stuff you need from Amazon, I think that's a great situation for you as a firm because you know that you will always be able to get it. But let's say you're making let's say, what do I have around me here? You're making markers that require a specific logo on the marker. Okay, it doesn't show it to you. And you cannot find another company in the entire Catalonia that can do it for you. That can be more difficult. So yeah, I think my model is talking mostly about firms that rely on highly customizable inputs.
I see.
May I jump in?
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So a couple of things. One is comment about intensity of search, which here is exogenous.
Yeah.
Which can go in your favor because 2.5 years is kind of too long.
Yeah.
And the second is to understand whether this is a model of it's a model of regular fluctuations or it's a model of extreme events. And in that sense, and since the model have no aggregate risk, it's kind of hard to think about extreme events in the model, I think. And on the other hand, if we think about idiosyncratic risk getting some aggregate effects, I think we will need some statistical argument like Gabe and Ashimolu, Basco, and all the others in the original 2012 paper. Because as some firms may be doing bad, some other firms are going to be doing good at the same time, I suppose. So isolating the effect of one idiosyncratic shock in the network, that's very illustrative, but there are going to be other shocks happening at the same time. And we want to know the sum up of all of them, right?
Yeah.
So are you, the model is complicated already, but are you able to cast the analysis in terms of, let's say, fatalness of links, of alternance of firms, or something that's gonna give you information that this effects are very nice, but they are actually going to survive aggregation.
Right. So let me answer question by question. So exogenous intensity of search, indeed, I think that's a very promising avenue for extension, and something that I always like extension that don't complicate the state space. And this is one thing that does not complicate the state space if all firms in the same states will always make the same search intensity decision. So then that's something that's definitely doable. And yeah, indeed, when you are in a situation where lots of links have disappeared, you would presumably want to be searching more intensely. Okay, the second point, sort of about the sort of, I think you were talking about sort of granularity discussion of firms, so that sort of shocks to large firms actually are large enough to cause business cycles through, just because these firms have large DOMAR weights. So in this setup, there's sort of, as everyone is sort of living in this continuum over here, we would have to sort of consider, okay, everyone is sort of living in this continuum over here, and whether they are productive or not, it makes them sort of large or not, but in their very, very small, tiny market. So to sort of introduce these kinds of things, maybe through the back door or something, would be to consider sort of like aggregates of these firms as being one in a way. Or another thing I've been considering is sort of like having these generic producers with whom unmatched firms can trade, or there are small firms and large firms. And if you trade with a large firm, you okay, I got a notification. So if you trade with a large firm, the shocks propagate to a larger section of the economy. So there's, I hope that mostly answers it. So here there's no granularity, but I think it's also possible to bring this kinds of discussions into the model.
Yeah, because you see my point. My point is that there is a lot of action, a lot of going on.
Mm-hmm.
But if we simulate the economy, we should gonna get nil effect on the aggregate.
If we
unless
simulate,
there is an aggregate shock, but the model does not allow for aggregate shocks.
Yeah. So
you see what I mean?
Yeah. So what I do here is a sort of MIT shock, which is the
Right.
sort of unexpected aggregate shock, which firms then react to. So yeah.
And then it's a model about extreme events.
A little bit what's happening here in this example. Yeah, certainly it's an extreme event. Certainly. But yeah, so I think I see your point is it would be interesting to bring in aggregate risk and see how firms endogenously react to aggregate risk when forming their supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
and so on. Yes, point well taken. I believe, I think this is something that is doable. Potentially, it will require moving on to the sort of deep learning based solution technologies that other people are doing for search models in labor. So Yucheng Yang being one of them that I'm in touch. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the comments. Very much enjoyed the talk.
There are no more questions. We can use this room for the office hours if you want, or yeah.
Yeah,
It's okay
I think
for
that's
all of
perfect.
you.
So thanks everyone for listening,
Yeah.
and happy to take more questions.